You're listening to Temps Passé from Bailiwick Podcasts. In this series, we share some of the most important, amusing and illuminating stories from Channel Islands history. This week, we're marking the 80th anniversary of D-Day. In the first of a three-part special focusing on Jersey, historian Ian Ronayne reveals the involvement of a Jersey resident in one of the most celebrated engineering achievements in history.
Part 1. War-winning work. Jersey's connection to Normandy's famous Mulberry Harbours. The images laid on the table were astonishing. German intelligence officers poring over the recently developed reconnaissance photos struggled to comprehend what their eyes were telling them. Allied forces invading Normandy in the summer of 1944 had brought a harbour to France with them. A vital tenet of Adolf Hitler's strategy to defeat any attempted invasion of the continent was denying his enemy access to a large seaport. If the Allies were unable to land tons of supplies needed to sustain their armies once ashore, the attacking troops would wither in the face of German resistance. As a result, Brest, Cherbourg, Le Havre, and several other major ports, along with the Channel Islands, received a significant share of all effort and materials poured into Germany's Atlantic Wall, the line of coastal defences constructed between Norway's northern tip and the French border with Spain. These ports simply must not fall into Allied hands. Hitler had insisted. Now, the images taken by the first German reconnaissance aircraft to penetrate the powerful Allied aerial shield guarding Normandy's landing beaches revealed the stark truth. The high-flying, high-speed jet warplane had overflown one of the most innovative, important and highly secret developments of the Second World War, the Mulberry Harbours. Remarkably, one of those closely involved in designing and constructing these artificial harbours had a very strong Jersey connection. George Howard Gibson, who was originally from Yorkshire, had come to the island before the Second World War and settled with his family, who lived first in St. Peter and later in St. Lawrence. Mr. Gibson was an accomplished civil engineer. Together with his brother John, he had undertaken numerous large-scale and prestigious construction projects in the interwar years, including building complex dams on the White Nile and Blue Nile in Sudan. It may have been a tropical illness contracted during one of these overseas postings that led Mr. Gibson seeking out Jersey's pleasant and healthy climate as a place to recuperate. The work in Africa had brought the Gibson brothers into a close working relationship with British construction company Pauling & Co. In 1931, the brothers and company entered into a partnership, with George Gibson subsequently becoming a director of Pauling & Co., a role he held when the Second World War began in 1939. After evacuating his family from Jersey prior to the occupation, Mr. Gibson reunited with his brother in the UK, who was engaged on essential war work. Among their most important projects was the design and construction of a revolutionary but highly secretive floating harbour. The concept of a harbour that could be floated across the Channel had first been aired following a disastrous attempt to land a force at Dieppe in 1942. On that occasion, Allied forces failed to seize the French port in the face of strong German opposition and challenging landing logistics. With the enthusiastic backing of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Allied planners settled on the idea of creating an artificial harbour rather than rely on capturing a major French or Belgian port. Codenamed Mulberry, the final design consisted of a complex set of interlocking components called gooseberries, constructed separately in Britain but brought together and assembled in Normandy like a huge Meccano set. The first parts to arrive would be several elderly merchant vessels and warships sunk offshore to create an initial barrier against weather and tidal conditions. Helping create a sheltered harbourage were the second components called bombardons, which linked up to form an outer floating breakwater. To be positioned within the shelter of these crucial exterior sea defences were rows of enormous phoenix concrete caissons that floated when empty but sunk to sit on the seabed once filled with water. Finally, floating piers and roadways called whales and beetles inside the sunken caissons allowed lorries laden with supplies to drive directly from arriving ships to the shore and into the vast storage depots established in the surrounding countryside. In 1943, the British Ministry of Supply asked the Gibson brothers and their Pauling & Co. engineering and construction company to design and build the vital Phoenix concrete caissons. Within months, the Gibsons contracted 150 engineering firms from around the country and explained the top secret requirements. the work's vital nature was emphasised, with the assembled team sternly told it isn't a question of whether it can be done, it's a question of when it will be done. After experiments and testing to prove the design, work began in several locations to manufacture the huge caissons, some of which weighed 6,000 tonnes. With seemingly boundless energy and ingenuity, the Gibson brothers drove the effort forward through the winter of 1943-44 to ensure the harbour was ready for the following spring. The construction companies involved and tens of thousands of workers engaged in the project succeeded. On 6th of June 1944, even as Allied troops were fighting their way off the beaches, the first Mulberry Harbour components were on their way to Normandy. They would eventually form two separate artificial harbours, Mulberry A, constructed off Omaha Beach, where the American forces landed, and Mulberry B off Gold Beach, which was stormed by the British Army. After a channel storm severely damaged Mulberry A in late June 1944, Mulberry B, or Port Winston as it was christened, became the principal location for landing supplies in Normandy. It remained in use for 8 months, which is far longer than intended. During that time, the port handled 2.5 million arriving men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. The astonishment of German intelligence officers looking at the reconnaissance photos taken soon after D-Day is fully understandable. Laid out before them was not only an extraordinary facility destined to help the Allies to victory in Normandy, but also one of history's most remarkable feats of engineering. George Gibson, one of the engineers partly responsible for this achievement, returned home to Jersey after the war and settled back into St. Lawrence with his family. Bluff-speaking, but always unassuming, he turned his attention to breeding prize-winning Afghan hounds and keeping and showing horses. For many years, Mr. Gibson was district commissioner of the Jersey branch of the Pony Club. He died in 1963 at the age of 73 after a short illness and was buried in St. Lawrence Cemetery. While his name and role in history may not be well known in the island today, his extraordinary legacy remains to be observed just a few miles away in Normandy. When next visiting the bustling little seaside resort of Aramanche and staring with awe at the huge remains of concrete caissons lying not far offshore, perhaps give a thought to George Gibson and Jersey's connection to D-Day, the Battle of Normandy, and ultimate Allied victory in the Second World War.
Thank you for listening to Temps Passé. This episode was brought to you by Bailiwick Podcasts and the Jersey Evening Post. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. And sign up for a digital subscription with the JEP to get access to its rich online archive and learn more about the island's history. Thanks again for listening.